New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
From the New Thought Media Network, this is the Conscious Reality Show with your host, Sarah Stevens-Nichols, where conversation plus intention reveals a new reality. Every week, Sarah and her guests will discuss what they know and what they don't. Experimenting in front of everyone with what else is possible. I'm Sunny Childs, and here is your host, Sarah Stevens-Nichols.
Hey, thank you, Sunny. So glad to be here. What a wonderful day. Not another gloomy day, as ER would say, but a beautiful day. And a beautiful day to explore various things. What's on my mind this morning is, since this show is called the Conscious Reality Show, I constantly get questions about reality and consciousness and what is conscious reality. And I have all these sort of political and policy and real world types of people that I know that I want to come on and explore the possibility that there is more than what they actually experience and believe to be true with their senses and feelings. And then I have all these sort of consciousness, spiritual people who I want to come on and talk to me about what people think they're experiencing and what consciousness has to offer them. And sometimes the people that think there's only the reality in front of them don't want to come on the show because they don't want to consider that what they experience as real isn't real. And sometimes the people who, I mean, there are people that I talk to who believe that nothing is real, of what nothing is real, if you remember the Beatles song, and nothing to get hum about. And they don't want to talk about the apparent suffering reality of people. And then there's all these people in between. And so those are the ones who will come on the show and talk about whatever, the cool stuff they're doing and the cool stuff I'm thinking and wondering about. I wrote this morning in my newsletter about how we think that we have to have shared interests with people and a lot in common and agree on everything to be good friends. And that's what we sort of look for in a friend and maybe a lover. You know, it's the first thing people put on their dating pages, as far as I can tell, is what they like to do and what they believe. And they want to find someone who agrees with them on those things. But my experience is that it's actually just good old stinking quantity time, not quality time, that actually creates real relationships. It's just spending time with people. And my guest here is a person who I have spent a fair amount of quantity time with, especially a long time ago when we were young children. Well, not young children, old children, young adults. And this guy, Paul Edison, is someone that I love and adore, and who is interested in so many amazing things. And many of them are not interests of mine, but that does not mean I don't want to spend time with them and talk to him about those things. Geology, stars, whispering, to the rocks and the stars, and having lots of opinions about things. Welcome, Paul. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Sarah. It's an honor to be on your show. Although I have to say, I'm a little intimidated by some of your previous guests who have books and actual careers. I'm retired, and most of the work I'm going to talk about today is volunteer work that I do in science communication and kind of the politics around that.
Yeah,
very much manager.
Yeah, well, I'm intimidated by many of my guests too. Yeah, well, I like having. I'm intimidated by you though too, because yeah, so if that makes you feel any better, just because you often just really seem to, I'm writing a book, it hasn't been published, on how to know what you know, and it seems like you at least for the past few decades have been pretty clear on knowing what you know.
That's
like you're not ambiguous about what things you know and what you don't know.
I don't know how that sounds. I take that as a compliment.
Yeah, it is a compliment, because you're centered in your own knowing is what I mean. You know about yourself, and you know what you know, and maybe you know what you don't know, and you're able to cop to those things.
I hope so. Thank you. I hope so.
Yeah. You said you didn't want to talk about this, but I am actually going to talk to you for a second about I'm sure you want to talk something about geology, because you're really a geology buff.
Mm-hmm.
And but you don't have to. But
here's the title here, so
yeah. Here's the thing that I've been thinking about since we had a conversation in Portland a couple months ago, or was it weeks? I don't know. So when I was in my master's program and studying for Masters of Consciousness, so just any of you who don't think I have the right to throw around the word conscious or consciousness, I have a master's in consciousness.
I'm aware.
So I am allowed to do that. But one of my professors was this guy, Christian De Quincey, and we can put him, I have him on a banner because I realized I was springing this on my producer. And he wrote a lot of different books, and one of them was called The Soul of Matter. And one of the things he does, he's also, well, he's even more of an expert in consciousness than I am, because he's written various books about it. But he's very interested in rocks and consciousness. So I just wanted to tease this out to you.
Okay.
So he says that if anything that exists, so if consciousness exists, then and by that he even just means the sense that anything from sort of I think therefore I am to anything else we might call consciousness, if I am, because I am able as a human being to perceive that I am thinking and knowing, and to see that means that doesn't just spring out of nowhere in humans. It means that it is there, all what he would call all the way down, which means that rocks have consciousness too. Do you think rocks have consciousness?
I don't believe that, but there are quite a number of philosophers, including neuroscientists, Kristen Koch, for example, who believe that consciousness is just immanent in nature everywhere, and that human consciousness is just a manifestation of that. I have maybe a more narrow view of where consciousness evolves in chordates and animals, and specifically. But that I think was the impetus for this conversation, which is you and I have very different concepts of nature, and I don't know if we have different relationship to nature is another question. Yeah. But I have a different view of consciousness, a different view of quantum physics, which I'm no expert in. And so that struck me, that's kind of an interfaith conversation. And that's important to me because of the work that I've done in science outreach over the past decade, reaching broader audiences of faith and political belief, especially in the work that I've done with environmental justice and bipartisan work, legislative work concerning earthquake resilience and policy around geology.
Well, this is the voice of God, Sunny Childs, your producer. And I am currently just into Robin Wall Kimmerer's new book, Gathering Moss. And the
Yeah.
first chapter, in fact, directly addresses this question of
Mhm.
rocks of consciousness. So I encourage our readers and perhaps anybody else listening to check it out, Gathering Moss by Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Gathering
Paul, I know
Moss.
you're
And
familiar with her work.
Yeah, and I think Kimmerer would probably agree with that sense. Not just that
wait, which sense? That
the sense
rocks
that
have consciousness
the
or not?
consciousness. I'm not sure if she would believe. I think that there's an animism. Whether rocks are actually consciousness, I'm not sure she'd have an opinion on. But that's an important position, not just because it's about right relation to nature, and that has tremendous political implication for the environmental movement and the hybridization of indigenous thought with the environmental movement. So I think Kimmerer would be comfortable with that idea that rocks have consciousness.
Well, I also know that you've done quite a lot of work in your role and outside your role of the Geological Society around Indigenous thought and practice in terms of your work. Could you maybe talk a little bit about that?
I would love to. I mean, it's been a real challenge. Politics of, we've all been thinking about or hearing about land acknowledgements. I started working on this issue maybe again about 8 or 9 years ago when I was president of the local Geological Society. Partly just, with sort of these DEI efforts that many of us have been involved in. And of course, everyone loves DEI now, and right and left. That's just, it's so popular. But that's
it's failing.
and
I
it's
mean,
the winds have shifted. I mean, when I was on
well,
the state board and we had the governor telling us we needed to read white fragility back in 2020, the winds were definitely going in one direction, and then they sort of have faded, and now they haven't reversed. But
well, I
in
don't.
any
I
event,
want to get back to
to
your
get to
thought,
your
but I
point,
do want to say that I don't mean that. I don't just mean that some part of consciousness has voted for a different reality. But what I mean is that it's actually been studied that the DEI efforts, like at the corporate level
yeah.
and in government and et cetera, haven't actually worked to produce and create what they say they intended. So
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we've accomplished. I mean, I'm proud of the work that we've done, and I don't want to be accused of false modesty, which, I'm not even very good at, frankly. But I've worked pretty hard on these issues over the past year, including with NAACP and with other environmental justice groups on the state level, on the state board. And in terms of actual accomplishments, we've made a couple policy changes, a few sort of programmatic developments. I'm proud that we started the Environmental Justice Committee with the local NAACP. We got a bipartisan effort on a bill to regulate the critical energy infrastructure, these oil tanks in Northwest Portland that are on the river on liquefiable fill that in the Cascadia quake will fail, catch fire, releasing toxic fumes, and then float downriver, causing environmental catastrophe. And we got folks in the room from both Republicans and Democrats, industry and environmental groups into the room. The effect of that, I mean, we'll see, but I'm proud of that work. And as I don't have political power, but I have some influence, and I've been really lucky to work with amazing people and be able to support their leadership, which is, when you're a volunteer, things only move with the speed of trust. So you can't really, that's where I want to make a claim to. I'm an amateur at politics.
I think there was something you were going
are.
to say about land acknowledgements that you didn't
We
get
were going to
to.
talk about, yeah. And it's so what we've found is that reaching out to folks who are either working with tribes or tribal members, including urban Native Americans who've been thinking about these issues, reaching out to folks, especially geologists, anthropologists, who are maybe in that divide between tribal interests and their own personal identity and scientific method and so forth, and the politics of what all of that means. But those are the folks that we've had come in and talk about their work, whether it's hydrology issues out in Umatilla, or anthropology issues and looking at rocks, for example, to see which rocks have been fire cracked and used by folks 5,000 years ago. And just there's a certain element of virtue signaling that one does in outreach, just to say to folks, I recognize that this is an issue and I'm open to the conversation. And part of that, if you're a white guy, you're doing it because you want people to like you, want people to accept you. It can be kind of hollow if that's all it is, as we all know.
Yeah.
So what I've sought to make those relationships meaningful, and that's been a struggle. That's been sort of building relationships one at a time and educating myself and reading tribal newspapers and trying to get a sense. I still feel I have a very tenuous grasp on it, and I don't have a lot to say about. Fortunately, in Oregon, we don't have a lot of politics that are divisive over geology right now. As you might in Standing Rock, you had a previous guest who a journalist who'd been there. We have some issues that are on the horizon. We have lithium mining, which is one, and then carbon sequestration in the Columbia River basalts would be another. But these haven't really emerged as hot political issues. We were able to do the work on the Senate Bill 1567, the bill to get DEQ to regulate the critical energy infrastructure, with activists in the room, including a friend of ours, Sarah, who whose method of activism is getting in front of industry, in kayaks or with picket signs, and to really, put a stop with folks from industry. And I'm proud of that. That's the. I mean, as I think about, how people are struggling now, we're all struggling with sort of where we are in the political landscape. And for those of us, again, who are amateurs at this, it's really just about building relationships. And, my politics at this point is just sort of to be, I guess, trustworthy to the people that I work with.
That's great. It's beautiful.
And I've been really
Paul,
lucky.
I'd like to follow up with what both of you just said.
Can't hear you, Sonny.
Oh, sorry.
You
Can't hear me.
We can hear you now.
Sorry. I'd like to follow up with what both of you just talked about and make a distinction. When you reference DEI, Paul, I think, and you, Sarah, I want to clarify. What Paul's talking about is developing relationship, not unlike what Jen Byers, our investigative reporter, talked about. What you were referencing in terms of the study, Sarah, is having DEI departments where there are trainings where workers go through these conversations and all is well. It was supposed to be a beginning. It was never meant to be the end all. What Paul is referencing is the actual meaningful things that one can do to impact in his role and impact geology and both the actions and the thoughts of this organization by meaningfully including in conversation and perhaps even shifting priorities as a result.
Jobs. We're hoping to increase the number, the diversity in the profession, and that's a different role that I have. So mostly I'm talking today about outreach, where I can claim to be an amateur, but I do a lot of graphic design and video work and just public presentations. The state board work is about bringing more people into the profession of geology, women, LGBT, people of color, and I think we've been pretty successful with increasing women in leadership. The profession. I'm on a state board of geologic examiners, which is sort of like the bar association for geologists, except that geologists don't misbehave anywhere near like lawyers do. So it's been pretty tame. And I think our efforts are, we haven't accomplished, what should I say about the work that we've done there? We had a lot of impetus from the state to really think about DEI and really take it to heart, but we're a small independent agency and we don't really have a lot of levers or funding to make that happen.
I want to shout out, or I'm going to give a rare shout out to the California Governor, Gavin Newsom, for having several years ago, he actually isn't anywhere near the environmental leader that he likes to pose as nationally. But one thing that he did that was incredibly important that you all are making me think of is appoint several years ago, because now we're in 6 years into Gavin Newsom's gubernatorial terms, Wade Crowfoot as his cabinet secretary, director of natural resources in California. And Wade has really integrated tribal wisdom into the Department of Natural Resources in California. And I had a chance to see it from the inside to a certain degree, when I was working for on staff for one of the senators the senator who chaired the Natural Resources Committee. So we worked a ton with Secretary Crowfoot, and none of what he's doing is performative. It's all really genuinely, I think we were talking about the difference between sort of performative.
Well, performative has
DEI.
become the new literally in terms of what it originally meant and what it means now.
Oh,
Would that these
I
efforts
did
were
not
actually
know
performative in the way that saying
God.
I do or I promise.
Oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
I did not know that. I reject that out of hand. I still reject the new literally. I remember one time I was sitting in a meeting where a woman said that she had seen her father literally turn into a vegetable, and I had to put a notebook up in front of my face to keep my face from showing what I thought of that picture, that image. But the consciousness of the vegetable and the consciousness of the person may be related. To come back to that, just that my guy De Quincy, and I do think a lot of people who are connected with indigenous wisdom do believe that every part of nature is consciousness. And he used to say, I don't know if he still does, because I haven't really caught up with De Quincy lately, but he used to say that all of nature was voting with his consciousness. I like that too. So what's happening, I think, with the change in the climate can be a form of nature voting, right? It's voting, it's morphing and changing, and it's voting for an end to humans right now. But also a lot of other nature is affected, obviously, by climate change.
Well, that's a very powerful political view. I would support the political agency of folks who believe it. It's not a view that I find works for me. But again,
are rocks affected by climate change?
Oh, tremendously. Yeah.
Oh yeah, tell me about that.
I don't think
I think they don't. They aren't. But they must be, right?
Well, there's a sense in which, there are folks in the scientific community or the amateur community who are comforted by the idea that, the essential crust of the earth will remain the same. I don't think that's very comforting, but there are folks who are attracted to science precisely because of, say, the pale blue dot idea, right? Carl Sagan's reflection on that image of the earth taken from the orbit of Neptune. And for them, it means that there's something beyond that, all this human mishigas, it can be transcended. Or maybe it's a sense of the divine. Again, that doesn't work for me. It kind of freaks me out. I think it's awful lonely up there, and it doesn't gainsay, the meaning of human joy and suffering. But that is a common connection that people have to the natural world, is to feel like it's a world that is outside of human it up. And in terms of how rocks are affected by climate change, I don't have a ready response to that.
Okay.
I mean, the rocks that I'm thinking about aren't for the most part, but there are ways in which I think chemically that's true, and I can't bring them to mind at the moment.
All right. Well, Sunny, can we go to acknowledge our sponsor now, and then when we come back,
I'll do that in just a second. I will say that while rocks may or may not be affected by climate change, the way in which humans interact with those rocks does.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about mining and all the extraction That's that's fundamental to the issues of climate change.
Oh, yeah,
So I'm not
absolutely.
sure if I got to the core of your question, Sarah, which is if rocks have consciousness, as you posit or seem to be attracted to that idea, is there a way in which nature is responding or even volitionally responding to human activity? And
Yeah.
I think
Well, I
there
mean,
are people that would work for him.
I think De Quincey would not say that the consciousness is the same as the way we experience it for rocks.
Right, right.
Like, not that it he would say it's a very slow consciousness. It's a
Hmm.
consciousness that happens over the lifetime of the rock, which is a lot longer than our lifetime, right?
Yeah, I would, I guess I resist a little bit the idea that we're being punished by nature. I think that brings a moral uh, accent in that I'm not sure I believe in. I guess I'll just say,
Well, I don't think it's like a judgment. It's more just that I don't like it when people say we're destroying the earth. We're not destroying the earth, especially if you're thinking of it as a planet.
yeah,
The planet is here and it's probably going to stay. We're destroying our own habitat. We
yeah,
are destroying
mhm,
human habitat, and I actually think it's misleading when people talk, and not useful when people talk about destroying the earth, because it implies that it is about it, the existential threat gets kind of hidden there.
yeah. I think people are worried about human suffering by and large, their own, and
Right.
the potential of mass, and disruption, and they're terrified of that.
Yeah.
I'm terrified of that for understandable reasons. But I'd make a distinction that um, Robin Wall Kimmerer's idea about right relation and the animism of the earth is not one that appeals to me on a number of levels. But who cares? I mean, that idea is politically more powerful, and what I support ultimately is the agency of people like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who are out there doing the work to change the world. And that's more important to me than being right on the sort of causal facts. And I think in that, and this is what I'd like to explore a little more, my secular scientific humanism is there's a spirituality to it, and it is definitely a spirituality of humanism if you believe that such a thing exists. What
Mm.
excites me is the narratives of discovery of Galileo looking through the telescope and seeing those four Jovian moons, those beautiful white lights moving around the planet every day, or Hutton at Sicker Point in Scotland, where you have two layers of strata, one this way and one this way, showing the evidence of deep time, or and on and on. Those narratives of discovery, in that sense that there's more in the world to nourish our sense that the world has to teach us, is essential to me. But I use the word discovery advisedly, because the flip side of that is that discovery, the doctrines of discovery have been important, have been fundamental to the exploitation of the environment and colonialism and capitalism and so on. And I don't have the moral grasp or ken to resolve those paradoxes. Again, I'm on the political level, I'm just trying to work with the folks around me. Like most of us, my morality is determined by my community and my family and my biology. And the
All right.
ideology
Well,
is a little less important to me than these moments of observation that bring us into closer contact.
thank you, Paul. Let's take a break to acknowledge our sponsor. And when we return, we'll return to the spirituality of humanism and whatever else we want to talk about.
Rocks.
New Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
And welcome back. And also welcome to Lilita K, who is our absolutely most rabid fan, and glad to have you here. Lolita said, secular scientific humanism, yes, when you mentioned that. So I just wanted to shout out to that. And Lolita, who I think I know as Lily, any other questions that you have, we'd be happy to hear. And you can even pop in if you want. We'll see what happens. We've never done that. Paul, spirituality of humanism.
There's a lovely passage in it's a book called What the Robin Knows, and this is actually more about birding than, but you'll get
Okay.
to the
Good, because I know more about birds than
okay,
rocks.
good. It's about and I think one of the reasons I'm in the show is I'm FOS, friend of Sarah. We both went to the same liberal arts college here in Southeast Portland, and I still live next to the natural area here, the Little
Beautiful
Reed Lake that the Reedies call the canyon. And that's where I found this rock that Sonny may be able to show us. Okay, I'm going to tell the story of this rock in a second. This rock is famous. It was in the Reed College Alumni Magazine. And I'll get back to that. But first about birding. So the idea is when you're out in nature, and I don't get out as much as I should living here. I live kind of... I live in a house that has glass windows facing the canyon, and I don't walk out as much as I should. There are a lot of people who are much more outdoorsy than me, and have much more of a sense of like projecting their agency onto nature, rock climbers or engineers. And there are a lot of folks who have a lot more sort of spiritual relationships in nature. But I go out, and the idea is that you have both a zone of disturbance and a zone of observation. The zone of disturbance is the noise you're making, and you're just your visual, the things that animals or birds are picking up. And they know, the urban birds know to distinguish humans from predators. The crows don't give a they don't give a hoot, and but the owls give a hoot, and they notice you, and they will stay back. You won't notice them if you're walking, so that your zone of disturbance is past your zone of observation. When you extend your zone of observation and walk more slowly, which I know Sonny's been with me, and it can be very frustrating for folks who are walking with me. But you extend, especially with birding, your auditory, you're listening more, you're trying not to move faster than your senses can take in.
Right.
And you end up observing so much more in terms of, not just bird life. You're noticing the sounds of birds in a nest, or the crows are mobbing. So you notice that there's an owl, there's a raptor out there somewhere. And just in terms of, looking at the ground, for example, you might notice that there are rocks in the ground. You might notice things about the foliage that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So that's just a practice. And I'm careful about wanting to describe this as something sort of as authentic. Well, there's something deeply spiritual for me, but what I want to emphasize is that, I'm out there. It's not tabula rasa. I'm trying to create a space, but I've got a map in my head. I've got these narratives, these stories in my. I have a literal map here, the geological map of Portland, and so there's a very vital interaction between the maps that we have, the narratives that we have, and our relationship to nature. And as I said, you're going to have a very different relationship or understanding depending upon, culture and beliefs about nature. And if your relatives came from County Cork in the 19th century and ran sheep through the trailhead at Shaniko, and you live in Eastern Oregon, you're going to have a different sense of what the land means. And if your folks came here, your grandparents came to work in the Kaiser shipyards and settled in the Black community in the 1950s, bought their house, but were then forcibly removed by urban renewal. Right. They built the hospital. Or if the indigenous example, if your earliest memories are being under the, wandering around under the table while grownups are talking about the Tribal Lands Commission and land back, people are going to have a very different sense of connection or dispossession or connection to ancestors, or not feeling the connection to ancestors, or safety or not. All of that we're bringing into those experiences of nature. And the common point, and this is what I do in the outreach that we are, is, I tell the story. I'm really clear. You don't have to believe any of this. When we talk about the stories, and this rock that we have here, this is a quartzite. It's a metamorphic rock. It's no longer, there it is on the screen. It's a metamorphic rock. And we don't, that's a very old rock. We don't have rocks of this age in this part of geologically young.
Oh.
So it had to come from far.
How big is it? I don't get the scale.
It's about that big. I have another here that's about the same size. In fact,
all right. And so you were able to spot this little tiny rock on the ground?
Well, I was looking for it, but yes, in fact, I reached into there's signs now that says don't pluck rocks out of the canyon. But at the time, there weren't any signs that said that. So yes, this is a rock that I noticed. It has a story.
Okay.
Our story, the geologic story, I think we can share, that most people believe this, is that there were these tremendous floods in the Ice Age. And so all this water that was impounded, if you go up to Salish and Kootenai Reservation up in Missoula, or Montana, there's a lake there now, Flathead Lake. During the Ice Age, as you remember, the United States was invaded by these giant ice sheets. And it blocked off drainages and created this huge glacial lake that we call Glacial Lake Missoula, held back by ice dams. When those dams broke, it released all of that water and rock and ice and so forth, and it came pouring through the Columbia Gorge at 60 miles an hour, and it filled up to a height of 400 feet, and then left the sands and gravels that my house rests on now. And it's at the intersection of the gravels and fine sediments that we have this Reed Lake and the springs there that feed it. So the story here, again, you don't have to believe this, is that rock came from far away long ago, from, we believe, the Montana Fold Belt up in Idaho, and that it's 1.5 billion years old. And it was once a beach. It's sandstone, or it's metamorphosed sandstone. It was once grains of sand, covered up, metamorphosed, uplifted into a mountain, eroded out as a boulder, and then a cobble, and then here it is, rounded, as you can see, by the action of water, and in our backyards. So those are the sorts of stories that we tell. Instead of 40 days and 40 nights, we have actually 40 floods here in the Pacific, in the Portland Basin. It's an incredible story. I believe it. Fundamentally, I'm curious about it. I'm curious about the parts that still are unresolved. But that to me is a narrative not just of the rock itself and its experience and these temporal and spatial dimensions of, big time, big space, little time, little space, but also the human story of J. Harlan Bretz, who was the first person to propose that we actually had these floods, and then the geologists, some of whom I've been fortunate to actually, work with and be out in the field with, and listen to their speculation, listen to them in front of an outcrop, looking up and saying, I don't know. Often there's still this frontier of questions that are still open. So all of that is, in my experience, of finding a rock in the canyon.
I love that. That's beautiful. I always believe
to share.
I'm curious whether you believe this. I always believe that interest is a function of knowledge, that most people don't really have an inherent interest in anything. They learn something about it and then they become interested in it. What do you think of that? And how did you learn enough about geology to become interested in it? What was sort of the cause and effect there?
I haven't thought that through. My interest in geology began, I think, rather abruptly on the morning of February 9th, 1971, in the Silmar earthquake, which I lived through. But my dad used to take me out to see the fossils in the Topanga Hills. I had moved away from that interest in science when I came to college, and I focused more on social justice issues. And, I was a domestic and sexual violence prevention educator in the public schools for a decade, my involvement with the women's movement really shaped some of this idea about listening too. Frankly, I mean, this is where it comes from. But and then I was an attorney and I worked in family law. While I was in grad school and my wife was also in environmental studies, we started both thinking about astronomy and geology. And for me, it was a way, like I mentioned before, getting away from thinking about these other social issues.
But
Eventually,
didn't you also find that the more you learned about it, the more you were interested in it?
oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
It
I do
becomes,
not, I'm going to just be the first to admit here in this crowded room, of that I don't know enough about geology to be interested in it. So that's sort of
mm,
why I asked this. I I used to really think that there were just sort of inherent interests, and I guess there are kids that are kind of born interested in one thing or another. But for me, it's always been like forced on me in the sense of
uh,
something causes me to learn about something, and now I'm interested in it.
mhm.
I'd
Like,
like to
yeah,
interrupt here and
yes,
go back to what Paul just referenced, was this idea of listening. And in fact, when we were talking about the title I had given him of Stone Whisperer, he had decided he'd rather be
yeah.
a stone listener. And we have an audience member who wants to talk about listening. And I'm going to throw that comment up.
Okay. Can you see this comment on the screen? What the robin knows. Is that about letting things in, such as when the robin waits and
Oh,
listens for
yes.
movement?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much richness to that idea. Now, the rocks aren't fleeing from me when I'm out in and they're not, I don't think they're responding to me, but others would feel differently. But the robins definitely are. And what the robin knows, thank you, Alita, for bringing that back in. You're really paying attention to how the birds especially are responding to other birds, to other mammals, and environmental conditions. And that book really goes into great detail about noticing animal trails and so forth. I'm not on that level. I do notice, I'll notice a nest. I'll notice what the crows are doing. I'll notice a new bird call. Um, I'll notice that the robins are freaking out about something differently. I had an experience where the crows were freaking out, and I thought, oh my God, they've got an owl or a raccoon grabbed a baby crow. But no, it was it was a neighbor cat that they didn't like. So I do notice those things. That's, I think, so tuning into the way nature is responding is a big part of that sensibility.
And
I
I would
think
just
there's a
say
bit,
that listening then and
yeah,
noticing then is part of the process of getting curious and getting excited. Because if you don't pause to listen or notice, then you don't have any questions.
absolutely. I think there's a metaphor there for the first stage in listening to other human beings. And I don't want to overextend it, but the idea is that there's a moment where you have to kind of suppress your own objections or your own, you have to really be open to an authentic connection with another person to learn more about them. And that is particularly difficult across sometimes boundaries of faith or belief. But the next step in that doesn't necessarily happen with a rock is you have to make the other person feel seen. David Brooks has a lovely book about this. You might be surprised to learn, but I think a lot of us that came to us from. I have to, I've been very fortunate. I was able to work on issues within and around the women's movement, both in activist groups and then on the level of state government and the courts. And listening was essential to my survival in that profession, but in those professions. But it was also essential to an essential fundamental idea of the necessity of the necessity of what? The necessity of listening across boundaries between men and women, between race, and so forth. The importance of, I guess, what we call, maybe not as much now, but allyship. And I have a lot to say about that if we want to explore those ideas. But I think that,
Well, those are interesting. However,
that's maybe another show.
one of our viewers here, Craig Spencer, has thrown out a question. I believe in, or a comment really. I believe in that rock's amazing history, but my map is a mandala experience of light as a reciprocal blessing between me and all beings. So that is his comment.
Yeah. Is there a question there?
I don't know.
Yeah,
It's not a
that's a
question, I
wonderful,
guess.
that's a wonderful way of expressing it. I'm not sure I understand it fully, but I want to try to remain curious to what that means to Mr. Spencer, who happens to be my father-in-law. But and that's part of my motivation for wanting this interfaith dialogue is it frustrates me that, and I need to give it frustrates me that my reaction to folks who have a different view of causal relations in nature, or your view, Sarah, for example, or my father-in-law's, is that my reaction is kind of crabbed and defensive. And I want to understand that. I want to be able to have conversations with folks who have, for example, a metaphysical, more of a quantum metaphysics view, or at least I don't want to exclude them. There's a sense of, in the outreach that I do, I want there to be hospitality. I want to express a certain degree of doctrinal humility, which science is not particularly known for. Although there is doctrinal humility within science in terms of the sort of line that empiricism follows, and the willingness of a scientist to say, I don't know. But in any event, there's not, of course, not very much doctrinal humility toward things that are outside of science and religious belief, for example. That's always bothered me, is the bigotry toward people of faith. And that's something that I hope to make a little space in my connections with folks for a little more openness to. But I still struggle with that. Even the other day, I had a friend who came to our rock show and tell and was talking about this local Portland author who's written a book about how biology facilitates geology. And my friend started talking about how this idea that we have granite because there are what are those little things? Bacteria.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's not how granite. I was immediately, and part of it is because I detected that there was this set of ideas, this idea that right relation comes out of understanding the relationship between a sort of Gaia hypothesis that bacteria contributes to geology. And I was reacting to that. And there's a substantive reason. It's because I've spent time understanding the empirical connections that lead to, I've been talking about how granite's formed for 15 years. So I'm sort of jealous of that. But what I want to make myself open to, or at least open to the conversation, and with you as well, is to have more space for my spirituality to be understood. And also my sense that, my relation to scientific humanism does not give me a better moral or political perspective. I mean, I just don't, or judgment, I would say. That's one thing I want to put out in terms of doctrinal humility. And I don't know if I share that with other science communicators, but that there is something fundamentally and importantly spiritual for me in my relationship to the human connection through discovery to nature, as fraught as that is historically. I don't know if I answered Craig's question. He and I can have that conversation in more detail going forward. Because
well, I don't mind it going on here, but I think that's the reason that I originally brought up quantum physics to you, was that a few weeks ago, and then we almost got into it, and then I said we could do it on the show, and then we haven't. Is that at the level of the quantum field, everything, which is below everything, right? Everything comes from that. So I said that, well, I'll say it this way, that the rock that appears to be Half Dome in Yosemite, quantum physicists tell me, and this relates to what, a biological perspective would be as well, but quantum physicists tell me that thing that appears to be Half Dome could just as easily be anything else. That at the level of the quantum field, you can't tell from looking at the quantum field that it's going to be Half Dome, or it's going to be a city street in Sacramento where I live, or it's going to be StreamYard, the platform that we're using, and the laptop that I'm using to talk to you on. None of that is predictable at the level of the quantum field. It's all just light. And then when light collapses into particles, the quantum physicists say it's consciousness that collapse it, and that it's agreement of something, whether that's the agreement of God, whether it's the agreement of humans or anything else. I mean, it can't really be humans, because the quantum field could just as easily be humans or rocks. And you don't believe that. You think if it's Half Dome, it's Half Dome.
Well, I'm
And
not,
then
first of all, I'm not sure I can, I mean, as you've pointed out early in the show, you have a master's, and I've read a little bit about quantum, and
well, you can't debate quantum physics with me, but
no,
the way that you think about it is, the rock is the rock is the rock.
Well, to me, quantum is actually more of a principle of humility within science, that, you know, we don't know we can't know the velocity or the momentum of a particle. You know, we can't know both. And although, you know, to be honest, that humility doesn't go very far when quantum mechanics explains the motion of electrons across the substates of superconducting materials that we find in our phones. So there isn't really much humility that emerges from that. But again, you know, your view is as different in your understanding of Half Dome as, I think, someone who has a sense of the divine in Half Dome, a sense of a theological relationship. And that's where, to me, it feels like an interfaith conversation that, you know, neither of us, what has to be interesting to me, and this is where I still struggle, is how that belief works for you, what, you know, how it connects you to the world, how it connects you to your community. It's not just that you have a master's and have read about this and have lectured about it. It's that you've built community and in service based on those beliefs. That's much more important to me than our differences on the reality of Half Dome.
Well, you know, what's interesting is, and I don't know that I can fully explain this. I am in absolute awe of Half Dome, right? Every time I see it, and I'm lucky enough to see it quite a lot, because I go to Yosemite a lot, and I live 3 hours from it. And when I go to Yosemite and I'm in the presence of Half Dome, it is absolute, and all of Yosemite Valley is a cathedral for me. And this happens to people all the time, but I'll never forget this one friend of mine who had lived his whole life in the Sacramento area, never gone to Yosemite. And I sort of dragged him there, and he came on his own, not with me, but he was coming to meet me in a group there. And he said that the second he hit the Merced River Valley, he just started crying, and he just cried all the way until he got to where we were. And he was like, there's no way I could have known or felt or known Yosemite until I actually was there. Like, no picture possibly did it justice, right? And just being there completely changed his heart and his consciousness being there. And that's how it is for me too. So it certainly feels absolutely real. And I'm not sitting there thinking, going, oh, this isn't real. Half Dome isn't real while I'm there. I'm noticing the human experience. I'm appreciating the agreement that we all have that Half Dome exists, and that we all agree and we all bask in it. I wish that we wouldn't all agree that Donald Trump exists and bask in that. I would love for consciousness not to have collapsed reality into an apparent that Donald Trump and his movement is almost as granitized as Half Dome.
That's interesting. I wonder, I mean, your sense of your question, what is possible? I wonder if you and I share a sense of the possible, in that I mean, in my view, we live in this world where there are 8 billion subjectivities, and our social world is conformed by that. That there's a reality to those 8 billion subjectivities that don't care about one's ideology. And people, seems like they can believe any possible thing that's remotely tethered to reality. That's just tremendous imaginative, creative force. And that means any conflict within those belief systems as well, which seems to be more of a feature than a bug. But that sense of awe in relationship to that universe of consciousness, of consciousnesses, past and present, I think I share that sense of potentiality. I wonder if there's some overlap there in terms of what you believe. And here, going back to the question of, we have different views of nature, but does that mean we have a different relationship to nature? I would have a similar awe, at coming in that first view that you have of the Yosemite Valley. So that's a question, I guess, and I don't know that we can resolve it without spending more time in nature, probably.
Yeah. Well, how come you've never come to Yosemite with me is my question.
I've gone to your cabin twice, Sarah.
You have?
Yes.
That must have been a long time.
I have pictures.
There are pictures.
Oh, okay. Well, then that shows you how good my memory is.
Yeah, we had these deep and meaningful conversations.
We did? Were we on drugs?
No, Shanti was with us.
Oh, okay.
My daughter was with us.
Okay, good.
But yeah, I think there's also, just going back with the map behind me, there's a kind of beauty and strangeness to when we encounter complexity, and that the scientific method is one way into that. But then when we encounter complexity in the social world, there's a point also that we need to, in this world where we live, where we have instantaneous worldwide communication, that I guess started with the telegraph, but now we have this much higher resolution image of this, the 8 billion subjectivities, that there are these moments where we again need to extend our zone of observation past our zone of disturbance, because for most of us, and those of us who are amateurs in our work, we need to be, and most people are. You think of social media, you think of most people are posting. Most people are listening, and that's essential to building relationships. Is this sort of working through complexity in a way that we build relationships one at a time. And for most of us, those are the most important questions that we have. Right now, I have friends who are concerned about American foreign military aid, friends who are concerned about mutual aid. What's most important to me is that I support their agency, their political agency, their personal agency. And what's important to me now is mostly that I listen and strengthen those relationships.
Well, we've been talking to someone who is, unlike me, very good at listening. And that's all the time we have. And so thank you, Paul, for coming. Let me turn our attention to actually very on time. Next week, we will have Reverend Dr. Victoria Bomberry, who is a tribal elder and who is a minister with the Centers for Spiritual Living, and her Winged Spirit ministry that focuses on community building, spiritual practice, social justice awareness, and environmentalism. She'll be here to talk about that. She's a wonderful, amazing being. And then it's onward. We're going to take a 3-week break and come back with a relatively famous internet phenomenon called Julia Sotis Mattis, who's an access consciousness teacher who I just love. So I'm really excited about that. I'll be speaking in a couple weeks here at the Sacramento Center for Spiritual Living. For any of you who are local, you could also catch it streaming online. And thank you, everyone, for the Conscious Reality Show and What Else is Possible.
Thanks to our guest, to host Sarah Stevens Nichols, and to the New Thought Media Network. I'm Sunny Childs, producer of The Conscious Reality Show. Join us live next Wednesday at 9 a.m. or stream the show at your convenience. Subscribe to Conscious Reality Show YouTube channel so you never miss a show. If you'd like to learn more about us, check out www.sarahstevensnichols.com.